right, here's some controversy for you. How do you decide what is appropriate to read to your children, and who should be responsible for making that call? Well, the news that changes have been made to the works of the best-selling children's author Roald Dahl has been met with lots of anger from leading writers who say that woke culture is leading to absurd censorship. Now, you probably read or watched one of Dahl's famous classic children's tales, from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory all the way to Matilda or the BFG, which have been translated into over 60 languages across the world. Well, now, current editions of his books, published by Puffin, are being released with significant changes to remove what is being deemed as hate speech and promote equality, diversity, and inclusion. Now, this includes removing words such as fat and ugly, along with descriptions using the colors black and white. Now, while some say that this is a good thing and a step forward in properly educating children, others say classics should be left alone and parents should ultimately make the choice about what they want their kids to read and consume. Well, joining us right now is our guest from the United Kingdom, Jeffrey Archer, a best-selling author. So, putting Roald Dahl aside specifically, is it time for us to change books that contain offensive and racist content?
Well, you have to be careful, because you have to first remember that he wrote it 70 years ago. So, of course, it's quite possible that if you come this far forward to 2023, that there will be words that are offensive, and if they're racist or sexist, of course, one must deal with that. But one must be also very careful not to mishandle the original writing. I knew Roald Dahl. He worked together on 3 of my short stories for Tales of the Unexpected, and I quite believe it when he said, if anyone dares to change my work, I'll send a crocodile out to get them. He was a tough guy. But there are, of course, understandably, words have changed over history, not least, Natasha, the word woke. Woke came into fashion in 1938, when 8 young black boys were accused, I say boys because they were young, were accused of rape and convicted by an all-white jury. And Lead Belly, the great soul singer, wrote a poem about them and a song about them, and that's where woke begun. Even that word has been stolen and totally transferred over the years so that it means something else. So I say to anyone who considers themselves woke, be careful.
All right, well, of course, it is important for us to make sure that we're exposing youth to content that is not racist, content that is positive and inclusive. Will changing the books of authors like Roald Dahl to reflect more inclusive rhetoric truly change the essence of the original pieces, in your opinion?
Probably not, but it's interesting that Puffin have decided to bring both books out together, the original version and what they call the sanitized version. Mm-hmm. My own personal belief is that the original version will outsell the sanitized version 10-1. In my own case, I wrote a book called Cain and Abel, and my publishers were in touch with me and said, we've seen 8 things we'd like you to consider, and there's no bad language in my book. There's no racism in my books. There's no violence in my book. So I was a little surprised. And I looked through them and said, I don't really understand this. Can you please tell me, as it's been read by Cain and Abel's been read by 100 million people, can you tell me how many complaints you've had? And they came back a week later and said, none at all. So I said, well, I think we'll leave it. So I think you've got to be careful, otherwise the woke people will have you charging into every book that's ever been written, and they'll go back to Shakespeare.
Well, who should be in charge of deeming what is acceptable and isn't acceptable, especially when it comes to children's books more specifically, and especially what should be put on curriculums?
Yes, it's a very good point, because they're now actually appointing people in publishing houses to read books and see what is sensitive. Well, I'm 82 years old. I'm sensitive, full stop. And they're not going to let them change my book. Sometimes, I'm sure you've heard the latest, Natasha, is that they're working on the James Bond books, the great Ian Fleming book.
Right.
Well, he was a misogynist. and he was a right-winger, but he was a damn good storyteller. And in their own time, that was relevant. Now, some of the words will have to be changed, but for heaven's sake, don't let's lose the whole story or the idea of the thing. James Bond is fun.
All right. Last very quick answer to this. I mean, is it time for old school authors to perhaps be phased out from school curriculums to make room for newer writers who may be, let's say, producing less offensive content?
Well, I think new writers will be looked at when they go to publishing houses, and I'm sure they will be very sensitive to getting themselves published. I understand that. I have sympathy with it, but I'm too old to join that game.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you, Jeffrey Archer, so much for joining us.